Okay, let's try this out. I hope it really works this time because, yeah, that was pretty miserable that last Friday when the network kept on dropping, but it seems like it was a Manoa problem. Alright, so let's get down to business, and first, let's go over, let me pull this up real quick. Okay, yeah, so final exams. So our final exam, this is for the Top Hat final exam. It's on Friday, December 17th, and it's a different time. Again, why is it different? Because I think if we were in person, we would have a longer time and we need to schedule things. So this is just something that happens with Manoa, especially if you have a class that's in person, you're going to have one of these blocks over here. So the exam itself is 15 minutes time limit, but it'll be open within this window right here. And again, this isn't something I just pulled up and just did by myself. This is the official final exam schedule for all of your classes. If they're not on this schedule, then they're kind of actually not following their assigned time. So again, I'm not going to, and the other rule is like the class with the higher enrollment has priority. So my class, I think the only class that has higher enrollment right now is the Intro to Bio. So I'm pushing back. My class is the second highest enrollment right now, so this takes priority over your other ones. And then, let's see, can you post the last two classes, please, and thank you. I think it should be up somewhere. I mean, if not, then I'll try double checking when the stream's over. Okay, so there wasn't a class on Friday because, again, that was an instructional day. And again, this is why we have that slot. So again, if you look at this chart over here and look at all your class, this is where it starts. Our class starts at 1:30, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So we're slot number 7. This is why we're on Friday. So if you're taking the Top Hat version of the final exam, it's on Friday, 2:15, not 1:30. So this is the final exam schedule. Yeah. And the final exam will focus mostly on the nervous system because we have a lot on the nervous system. But at the same time, you still gotta know things that relate to the nervous system, like the parts of a cell. Like the nervous system also has ion channels, has ions. It has like mitochondria as well, and gap junctions, and especially with the somatic nervous system, well, that controls skeletal muscle as well, right? So remember those neuromuscular junctions from Unit 2? So it all kind of comes together and kind of like builds upon each other. Now, am I going to just show you a bone and ask you which bone it is? No, that's more of a Unit 2 example, but at the same time, sometimes nerves are named after bones or bone markings. So this is where it's kind of like semi-cumulative, but it focuses mostly on the nervous system. Now, if you're taking at the Manoa Testing Center, they have limited seating, so whenever, and they're open all finals weeks. So wherever there's some slot here and whenever they have time, you can sign up for any time they have available. But again, if it's grayed out and you don't see the time you want, that means they're full up for that day or time. So the thing is, like, if you don't see the day, it's either too late or they're totally full up. So if you want to use the Manoa Testing Center instead of Top Hat, especially people who say, can I take the exam early? On Top Hat, no. But if you're taking at the Manoa Testing Center, yeah, you can take it early. And again, it's any time they have available. So again, they have the whole entire exam week available. But at what time specifically, you have to check because I think their update thing is in real time. Okay, now let's get back to real business and try to finish up the rest of the nervous system. So we're going to start on the autonomic nervous system. And again, this abstract schematic about how the nervous system is roughly organized. So remember, you have stimuli, some sort of change in the external or internal environment, and then these trigger responses and receptors that detect these changes. And these receptors, whether they be a neuron or a sensory cell, these are going to send action potentials up through afferent fibers that lead to the brain, or at least to the spinal cord, or the brain, or the brain. And then the brain, your central nervous system, which is just the brain and spinal cord. So again, spinal nerves and cranial nerves, they're technically part of the peripheral nervous system. So they're going to have those efferent signals that lead from the brain and spinal cord to the efferent division, and then the somatic nervous system is what we covered in the last lecture, so that refers to this. And remember that you have those upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons over here. and these innervate skeletal muscles. So this is voluntary movement. So remember that we can control. This is how we're able to do our daily activities, our voluntary control, and just have control of our skeletal muscles, contracting them to produce the movements we're doing when we walk, when we do our household chores, when we do our bench presses, whatever you're using your skeletal muscles for, that's involving your somatic nervous system. Now, what does that control? The upper and lower motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscle, and this is what the somatic nervous system is. But the other part of the efferent division or efferent division is the autonomic nervous system. And what does that control? Well, there's actually two divisions to the autonomic nervous system that work together. And these are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now these, what do they control? Pretty much the other type of muscles. So remember, there are three types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, which we typically think of when we're talking about muscle as a muscle anatomy. And then we have smooth and cardiac muscles. So smooth muscle you can find lining your blood vessels and also in some of your organs as well. And cardiac muscles, so that's your heart muscle. And also, what else is innervated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? Glands and other organs as well. So this is what we have here. So skeletal muscle, but everything else is pretty much the autonomic nervous system. Now, autonomic sounds like automatic, right? So think of it this way. It's like the autonomic nervous system functions by itself. Like, you don't need to consciously think about it. But when you're doing some sort of like movement with your skeletal muscles, you need to think about it. You need to plan it out, and you need to actually control the contraction and relaxation of all your skeletal muscles. Now, the autonomic nervous system, your heart beats without you even thinking about it. Your blood vessels constrict and relax without you thinking about it. Same with your glands, your organs. They all function without you really consciously thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to produce a little more hormone for my thyroid. Maybe I'm going to start to digest this, or maybe I'm going to increase the digestion. You don't really think about it and actually directly control it. You can affect it, but you don't actually have full control of your autonomic nervous system. So this is the focus of this lecture and the lecture after this. And I believe in the OpenStax version, or not OpenStax, but the OSU version, this is the last chapter, or like for the Anatomy and Physiology 1, I believe it's chapter 16. So I'm actually going to move this a little earlier because, again, this is a little more complex, and I'm trying to give you more time to digest not pun unintended, the autonomic nervous system. So this is chapter 16 in the Martini and chapter 16 in the OSU version as well. All right, so how is the autonomic nervous system? Well, this is just showing you a rough schematic, but what we have is this is sending signals from the central nervous system. Again, we have here. And now these are going to these collections called autonomic ganglia. So ganglia are a collection of cell bodies of these neurons, and this is a synapse right here. And all the ganglia right here, all the cell bodies here form this swelling called autonomic ganglia, and these are going to innervate these internal organs and the other two types of muscles. So again, not skeletal muscle because that's somatic. Autonomic is smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands and organs, and adipocytes as well. Now, we have all of these duos right here. So what do they all have in common? Well, there's two people, right? But what do all of these pairs have in common? Well, they work together, but they have different personalities. So a common misconception is like, yes, there's dual innervation, and often the sympathetic and parasympathetic, if they innervate the same thing, they kind of oppose each other and undo each other's work. But at the end of the day, they work together and they work in parallel. So the thing about the autonomic and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, they work together. They have different personalities, but it's possible to have like a high level of sympathetic nervous system and a sympathetic activity and a low level of parasympathetic, and for those levels to change. So it's like when the plot focuses on one of the pair versus the other. Same with their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So again, they're not foes, but think of them more as like a pair of protagonists, or actually they're both equally important, but think of them as a pair that work together but with different personalities. Now, with the sympathetic nervous system, notice that the anatomy itself is very different, and especially with the roots. notice that the roots of the sympathetic nervous system or sympathetic division is from the thoracic and lumbar regions, whereas up here we have with the cranium, up here the cranial nerves and the sacral roots over here. So they do have different roots and different origins, but you notice that a lot of these organs are shared in common. We'll get to that maybe by the end of this lecture, but I'm thinking this will probably have to be covered next lecture. But yeah, these two divisions make up your autonomic nervous system. And sometimes you might hear sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system. I use them interchangeably. Sympathetic division, at least for this class, is the same thing as the sympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic division, same thing as a parasympathetic nervous system, at least at this class. So yeah, I use them interchangeably. But the sympathetic division, notice that it has this arrangement right here. And again, you have all these roots going from the thoracic spinal nerves, and then also a few roots from the lumbar spinal nerves. So that's why sometimes the sympathetic division is called the thoracolumbar division, because it refers to the roots that supply and that lead to and from these areas. And when you hear the fight or flight response, this is what it means with that sympathetic division. So this is the anatomy of that system that carries all those effects when you have that fight or flight response. This is the one that causes all those system-wide and body-wide effects you feel when you have that stress response in response to fight or flight. But actually, I think that now they say it's not just fight or flight, but sometimes people get fright, and notice that like sometimes people, when they're in really stressful situations, they don't even fight or flight, they just freeze in place. They're so overwhelmed they don't do anything. So it's like not just fight or flight, that's the start, but also fright or freeze. So the sympathetic nervous system is also involved in the freezing response where someone just doesn't do anything altogether. So it's not necessarily just fight or flight. But they're all F's, so this is another way you can think of the F division. So what are the sympathetic responses? Well, you're encountering some sort of very intense situation, so you want to be more alert. It's like, oh, something intense is happening. Oh, okay, I'm going to go sleep. Well, maybe some people do that, but in a typical sympathetic response with stress, what do you want to be? You want to be, it's like, okay, I gotta be aware, or say it was like back in the caveman days, and then you see a big saber-toothed tiger, and then it's menacing you. So what are you going to be? Very alert, right? And then what's going to happen is you're also going to speed up your metabolism, especially in freeing up your energy stores, because why? It's going to be go time. You're either going to fight this thing, or you're going to fly or run away from it, assuming that you're not the type that freezes in place. And so what you're going to do is like, it's not the time to store energy, it's now the time to use energy, because you're either going to run away or you're going to fight something, you're going to do something about it. So you want a lot of energy to be mobilized in your bloodstream so you're able to carry out whatever you need to do. So you're also going to increase your respiration, and this is dovetailing with that whole part about muscle metabolism, right? So you want to run away from something. What do you need to generate a lot of ATP? Well, you can generate some ATP through lactic acid fermentation, but how do you generate even more ATP? Maybe you want to increase your amount of oxygen so you can do aerobic respiration, generate more ATP, so you're able to generate more, use more energy. And you're also going to increase your heart rate and blood pressure. So the big thing that's with the heart rate and blood pressure is going to increase your circulation. And by increasing the circulation of your blood, it's going to increase the rate at which oxygen and nutrients are delivered to your cells, and also the rate of removing carbon dioxide and waste from your cells as well. You're also going to increase your sweat gland activity. So the thing with increased metabolism, increased use of energy reserves, all the physical activity, it's going to increase your body temperature. So you need a way to cool off. This is a homeostatic mechanism of cooling yourself off. You're going to increase your sweat glands so the water can absorb the heat and dissipate and then evaporate so that you cool off your core body temperature. And so when you're trying to run away from something or trying to fight something, do you want to go to the bathroom right there and then? So the thing is that the sympathetic response is like, okay, yeah, using the bathroom is very important, but this is not the time to digest that burrito. This is not the time to think about using the bathroom and just downtime on the toilet. So now it's like, okay, that's important, but let's put a brakes on it. Let's shelve that and table it for later. So sounds like this, and this is the thing with the sympathetic nervous system and or sympathetic division, is that a lot of times people think, oh, it's a negative thing because it's fight or flight. This is an intense situation. What other also increases their sympathetic response is exercise, and notice that all of these are increased when you're actually actively exercising. So this, on the note of exercise, what letter does exercise stand for? It stands for E, right? So exercise is a classic thing that increases sympathetic activity. Same with excitement. So it's not necessarily just stress. Exciting things, like if something gets you really thrilled and amped, like riding a roller coaster, your sympathetic nervous system is definitely going to kick in. Emergencies, well, yeah, that can be stressful. That's definitely stressful. And embarrassment as well. So all of these involve, I mean, sometimes, I don't know if this term is still in use. It's been a while since I took in psychology, but there was like distress and eustress. And you can have like stress that's associated with positive emotion with the eustress, and then distress is the type of stress we typically associate with negative situations and feelings. And this is another way I remember it, is like if you look at the anatomy, at least of the chain ganglia, it looks like there's a bunch of E's. So I did like to draw a bunch of E's, like this is like an E here, and these are E's reflected. So this is the way I like to think of it. Sometimes this isn't an official name for it, but this is one way you can think of what are things that typically activate the sympathetic division. So this is why sometimes it's nicknamed the E division. Now, how about the other one that works with the sympathetic nervous system? So we have the parasympathetic nervous system or division, also known as the craniosacral division. So why? Because you have all these cranial nerve roots here. Not all of them, but you have several of them. And then you have some of these sacral roots over here. So put those together and you have craniosacral division. Now this is also nicknamed the rest and digest response. And notice that you have a lot of your digestive organs, but it's not just digestive organs. You also have other organs here as well, like your heart and lungs, and your kidney and bladder, and your reproductive organs as well. Now, so this is also why sometimes it's called the feed and breed, especially with regard to the reproductive organs over here. So that's why we have the parasympathetic. So basically things that are more with like the downtime and relaxation. Now, what happens with parasympathetic? How does your body react to parasympathetic activity? Well, you're going to decrease your metabolism. So now it's no longer you're not going to actually burn up your energy and your reserves. Now it's time to restore things. And then you're also going to decrease your heart rate and blood pressure, because now you don't want to have it. Imagine if you were sympathetic all the time. I mean, it might be good if you're doing a workout or if you're going for a jog, but do you want your heart and blood rate and blood pressure and your breathing to be increased all the time? You want to dial things back to a normal level. So this is where the parasympathetic nervous system or division also helps out. But it's not just about decreasing things, also about increasing things. So remember that rest and digest. This is the digest part. You're going to increase your salivary or saliva production, so you're able to chew up your food and do some chemical breakdown of the food as well. And you're also going to increase the activity of all of the abdominal organs that help you to digest your food. And increase digestive tract motility and blood flow, so you're also going to move the food more at a faster clip throughout your digestive system. And the digestive system, well, where do you get all your nutrients end up? They end up in your bloodstream, right? So you have all these blood vessels that lead to and from your digestive system. So especially the ones that lead from it, you're going to carry all those newly absorbed nutrients to the rest of your body. But you also need blood flow to actually carry those nutrients. So this is why you have increased motility over there. Now, simulation of urination defecation. So this is another interesting thing. So this is like you also not just about digestion, but also like the waste products. Like say you have drank too much fluid, or say you have too much food, or you need to get rid of your food or whatever food you don't digest eventually, right? So this is where urination and defecation comes in play. And also increased tear production. This is pretty much specific to your tear glands or your lacrimal glands. And also sexual arousal. So this is why it's also nicknamed the feed and breed response, because the parasympathetic fibers also innervate and are involved in stimulating the activities of the reproductive glands as well and organs. And let's see. So another thing is like, okay, look at the anatomy of the parasympathetic nervous system. Let's flip it this way. So we're going to flip it this way, and another nickname for the parasympathetic nervous system is the D division. So I like to think of it this way. If you laid out the parasympathetic, the spinal cord, and the parasympathetic fibers, especially the vagus over here, and the sacral nerves, it kind of looks like a D. So parasympathetic is all about the D, right? So it's the D division. So what does D stand for? It stands for downtime, digestion, diuresis, which is the medical term for producing urine, and defecation, which is the medical term for producing feces. So is this all of this, the things involving the D? No, not necessarily, but this is showing you a lot of the things that involve parasympathetic activity. Now, how are these similar? So we have things with sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system over here. Well, they both have, remember when we talked about like how many neurons you need to get from one place to another? So starting with the spinal cord, that's where we're starting out. So we do have signals coming up from the autonomic areas of your brain. But say we're starting at the spinal cord. So the first stop is what we call these preganglionic fibers. So these preganglionic fibers, I can't English today, they're leading from the spinal cord to the ganglia. So there's one step right here. So it's one nerve, and then you have the postganglionic fibers. So again, ganglia are a group of cell bodies, and then this postganglionic fibers, they're going to lead from this ganglia, and they're going to go to these target organs or tissues. So this is what we have, the preganglionic and postganglionic. So can excitation or adrenaline cause the urge to urinate and defecate? And that's the interesting thing. So this is why they're not necessarily, even though there's dual innervation and they tend to have opposing effect if they have innervate the same organ or tissue, thing is that you always have one, even it's not like one, you have an increase in sympathetic activity and that the parasympathetic is totally shut off. They're always there at some level. So sometimes like with the sympathetic nervous system kicking in, and we don't get to really cover the acute stress response too much in detail until next semester. But yeah, with the acute stress response and the general adaptation syndrome, you have that sympathetic activity. But the thing is that over time, your parasympathetic tries to dial back the sympathetic activity. So say you have sympathetic, your parasympathetic is starting to increase in the background, then you lower your sympathetic activity. Now parasympathetic kind of kicks in. So this is an interesting thing. Sometimes the parasympathetic system is trying to slam the brakes on things too much that actually becomes the dominant thing. So yeah, that's why sometimes you have this parasympathetic nervous system kicking in or becoming dominant when it's a stressful response. At least that's one of the leading theories behind why, yeah, excitation, some people like urinate and when they get excited, or they like, I can't tell my mom jokes because like, yeah, or that's TMI, but my dad, that's the reason why my father forbids me from telling my mom jokes. But sometimes it's like you get a situation where it's too funny or too stressful or too exciting, and then other parasympathetic activity takes over. Moving on. So sometimes, yeah, it's funny, like the stress kicks in, but sometimes with the sympathetic, but then the parasympathetic sometimes, it's always in the background, but sometimes it overshoots, and that's why we get like things that are typically parasympathetic appearing in typically sympathetic situations. All right, so again, the ganglionic and preganglionic over there. So the ganglia is a group of neuron cell bodies. And again, you need to know what ganglion is if you're going to understand innervation with the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So the fibers leading to the ganglion, so they're going from the spinal cord to the ganglion, is preganglionic, and the fibers leading from the ganglion to whatever target organ or tissue, that's postganglionic, sometimes just called ganglionic. So, but preganglionic is always called preganglionic. Postganglionic, sometimes they make the post optional. For clarity's sake, in my class, I refer to as postganglionic. So just FYI if you're taking other classes. So for the sympathetic nervous system, we have the preganglionic fibers starting in the spinal cord and leaving there and innervating these leading to these ganglia, and then the postganglionic fibers going from the ganglia to whatever target organ or tissue. Now the parasympathetic nervous system, it tends to have longer preganglionic fibers on average compared to the sympathetic nervous system. So the ganglia in the parasympathetic nervous system are located further on average than your sympathetic ganglia. So longer distance of the preganglionic fibers and very relatively short postganglionic fibers. So sometimes they're so short, or the ganglia is located right next to the organ, or sometimes within the organs itself. So this is one main difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the difference is that yes, similarities is that they both have preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system have ganglia. But notice that the preganglionic fibers are relatively short in the sympathetic nervous system, whereas they are longer in the parasympathetic nervous system. With the postganglionic fibers, they're relatively longer in the sympathetic, but relatively short in the parasympathetic. And actually right here you can see that sometimes the ganglia are located right next to or inside these organs in the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so another way I like to think of it this way, so if you, when I was a freshman, I also dormed in the Aloha Towers, and what usually happened, and it was so annoying, especially like somebody, they think it's so funny, they pull the fire alarms. So what happens when you have an emergency and fire alarm? Well, they pull the fire alarm, or say there's an actual emergency. You pull the fire alarm and all the alarms go off on every single floor. And this causes a big, the building-wide response that responds to this emergency. So I like to think of it this way. Like if you look at the anatomy of at least the chain ganglia on the sympathetic nervous system, they kind of look like a little beads over here. So I like to think of it as the little floors of this building. And the thing is that with the sympathetic nervous system, we say it is a fight or flight situation. This is something you need to do immediately. You need a fast response. So it kind of makes sense that you want something that's coordinated and has a very quick first step so that you're able to initiate a whole system-wide response to whatever situation you have right there. So that's one key thing with the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. With sympathetic, you can't really pick and choose. All those activities I mentioned in that list earlier, they all happen at once. So this is one thing with the sympathetic nervous system. Just like that building where all the alarms go off and you have an entire coordinated movement, same with the sympathetic activity. You have the increase or decrease activity of all of these organs. Now parasympathetic control, compared to having a system-wide response that occurs all at once, parasympathetic you can pick and choose. So just because you have parasympathetic activity does not necessarily mean that you're going to have parasympathetic activity in all the other organs. So it's less of a coordinated response and more like pick and choose what you want to do. So salivary and digestive gland secretion, yeah, that's rest and digest, but is that going to stimulate urination and defecation? Well, you can be eating, but are you going to eat and use the bathroom at the same time? Well, if that's your household, you do you. But the thing is that if you're just eating and just trying to enjoy your dinner, you might not necessarily be stimulating urination and defecation at the same time. You can pick and choose when to kind of do those, right? So if there's food in your stomach or something, yeah, maybe then your digestive tract will take over and start to move things along. But also, are you thinking about food and are you thinking about urination and defecation when you're crying? Well, maybe if you're stress eating, but again, you can have tear production with that independent of whether you're eating or using the bathroom. Sometimes maybe there is a situation where you do both, but it's not necessarily linked close together like it is with the sympathetic nervous system. And with the reproductive organs, are you going to think of what the dinner you had, or are you going to think about doing number one, number two in the bedroom? No. So the thing is that, Or again, like, yeah, so the thing is that you're able to pick and choose. Not all of this happens at the same time. That would result in some very interesting relationships if people did all of this at the same time. But hey, no judging here if that happens. But the point here is that you're able to pick and choose what you want to do with the parasympathetic. Whatever you need to do, whether it's digestion, using bathroom, or things in the bedroom, whatever room you're in, that's where your parasympathetic, the appropriate organs kick in. Okay, so we have our autonomic nervous system. Now let's talk more about sympathetic nervous system again. So this is also a common misconception. When we think about sympathy, the word sympathy, we think about something very nice, and we think of something who's kind of like being empathetic. We think of it as a positive word, but we also think like, oh, sympathetic is very stressful too with these fight or flight situations. So the thing is that sympathy is that is like a symphony. You play together and a lot of instruments playing together. Patho, like in pathology, refers to suffering or feelings. So when you express sympathy, you're saying you're feeling the same emotions together with someone else. You're suffering together with someone else. So that's where that sympathy, the nice version of sympathy, but sympathetic, this is where they name the division. They're saying like all these organs are suffering or feeling together. So this is why sympathetic division is a coordinated thing. It's not just pick and choose which organs are activated or downregulated. You're all having these organs suffer together. But again, it's not necessarily something negative. That's also a common misconception. Just like the exercise. So that's why I like to use exercise as an example. Because why? When you exercise, what happens? Well, your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, your metabolism increases, you start burning up your energy stores, and you also, are you thinking of when you're doing like going for a jog, are you really thinking of using the restroom? Probably not, right? So the thing is that with the sympathetic, it's not necessarily something that's negative. It's just showing you that's a coordinated response. And another way you can think of it is like gas and brakes. Like you have to use both to drive your car. I mean, if you're very skilled, maybe you can decelerate using turns or whatnot, or try to try to use inclines or declines. But you have to use your gas and brakes when you're driving, right? So you can think of like sympathetic as go time, and parasympathetic is like, let's slow down, let's break things. So not break things, like break things, put the brake on things. But the funny thing about your body is sometimes it's like those drivers, I don't do this myself, but I've heard of drivers where they somehow have what did they teach you in driving school? Like, don't have your foot on both pedals at the same time. Well, your autonomic nervous system is kind of a driver that uses both at the same time. So sometimes if you're pressing the gas pedal harder than your brakes, then you're going to accelerate, even though you're not completely efficient. But say you have your gas on and then you have slight brakes and then you let go of the gas. Then the brakes kick in, right? So this is the interesting thing about your autonomic nervous system. It's kind of driving with both pedals at once. So yeah, we have all of these over here, and this is why I love the exercise example, because what do you do when you exercise? You also sweat as well. And let's see, so here we have our ganglia and postganglia, and yeah, so just to recap right here. So here we have our preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. Oh, maybe that was a previous version I showed earlier. But again, the ganglia, these are these swellings that have a lot of these cell bodies, and these preganglionic fibers are shorter in the sympathetic nervous system, longer in the parasympathetic nervous system, and then, let me rewind there. Sympathetic nervous system, preganglionic are shorter, but postganglionic is longer. Parasympathetic, preganglionic is longer, and then the postganglionic are shorter. So what we have, the ganglia are closer to the target tissues. Sometimes they're actually contained within the target tissue, so this is what we call intramural ganglia, when they're actually inside these tissues. Now, the interesting thing is that compared to the synapses, like these, remember our axon terminals and telodendria? Well, instead of having just like a nice synapse like we have here, if you look at the postganglionic fibers, is that they have let's see, what is this one here? Oop, it's going backwards. Okay, so preganglionic fibers, again, this is a typical synapse we have at the ganglion. So we have a typical synapse over here, but postganglionic fiber, what we have is that compared to this synapse over here, we have these very interesting sort of what we call varicosities. So what they do is kind of like they have all these little vesicles that contain neurotransmitters, but instead of like having it directly on here, what they kind of do is like almost like a crop dusting. So what they do is that when you have activation of these postganglionic fibers, all these little varicosities, these little swellings, they're going to release their neurotransmitters onto the target organ and tissues. And here we are. So these are varicosities and all these vesicles. So when you activate these postganglionic fiber, it's going to like spread all these, sprinkle all these like neurotransmitters alongside these, or all along the surface of these target tissues. Now, ganglia, so let's talk about ganglia. Ganglia gang. Alright, so sympathetic chain ganglia. So this is an interesting layout of this. So it's just showing you, this isn't anatomically like showing you it in proportions and especially in size and layout, but it's just showing you the three type of ganglia you have in the sympathetic division. So the sympathetic chain ganglia, so we're looking at this cross-section of the spinal cord. So pretend you took the spinal cord and then turned it toward you and kind of like, so you're kind of seeing from top down, or maybe a top-down version of the sympathetic spinal cord. So towards the side of the spinal cord, you have the sympathetic chain ganglia. So this is what we have here, the chain ganglia. So they look like those, do I have one of those like chains? But you've had like those like long, like shiny metal ball chains, like the lanyards, whatnot. They, or like if you go to the bank and you see those pens that are hooked up to those chains, they look like little strings of beads on a chain, right? So the chain ganglia are like that. And they're also called the paravertebral ganglia because they're right to the side. So again, para is a common prefix meaning to the side. So these are ganglia all arranged along the sides of the spinal cord. So again, I like to think about this little alarm bell. So I think this is another reason why I like to think of it like that little fire alarm system. You have all those, if you ever seen like a building's fire alarm system activated, you see all those lights kind of lighting up along that row like there, and they're kind of like flashing. So and typically they're all located in the kind of same area on each floor, right? So I like to think of the chain ganglia kind of like that, like different floors, but you have these ganglia alongside each floor over here. But instead of floors, we have these spinal roots. Now, with the collateral ganglia, what we have, instead of being the chain ganglia we saw over there, these collateral ganglia, they are, so the interesting thing is showing it that these roots are going toward the front. So this is actually toward the anterior of the spinal cord over here. So these are the types of the three main ganglia over there, the celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. So these lead, the postganglionic fibers, these lead to all these abdominal pelvic organs over here. Now what we have here is how it actually looks like in real life. So even though it looks like it's off to the side in this figure right here, if you actually looked at the back, this is all the way from like the OG Gray's Anatomy, but this is where we have all the ganglia. So this is in the back of the, just before the vertebra right here. So you don't actually see the chain ganglia on this one, but this is just showing you how it looks like in real life. It's not actually off to the side. Main point here is that these are very important for digestive organ or sympathetic control of the digestive organs. Now this is where this figure gets a little confusing. It's saying like, okay, the adrenal medullae. So what we have here is that these preganglionic fibers, but they don't actually synapse in a ganglia. They actually go right to the center of our adrenal glands. And you might be like, wait, what's an adrenal gland? Well, these are your adrenal glands. So they sit right on top of your kidneys over here. So they're superior to your kidneys. You have two kidneys, and you also have two adrenal glands, a left and a right. And what we have, and this is actually something good to know in general, especially if you're continuing on to PHYL 142. Whenever you have a cortex and a medulla, the cortex is on the outside and the medulla is on the inside. Kind of applies like, I mean, cerebral cortex, that's the outer layer of your cerebrum, right? Medulla is kind of inner, more inner. But yeah, for other organs and tissues, if there's a cortex and medulla, cortex on the outside, medulla on the inside. Same with the adrenal glands. So the adrenal medulla is in the middle, they're in the center of it. Now, remember our preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. So we have our ganglion and our preganglionic fiber, and our postganglionic fiber is going to innervate our target organ. Now, that is typical of the sympathetic nervous system, but the adrenal medulla is special. So it's a very, put a little asterisk, put a little highlight. This is very important difference between the two. So in the adrenal medulla is that preganglionic fibers, they don't actually stop at a ganglion. They actually go right to the center of the adrenal glands. So they directly innervate the adrenal medulla. There is no ganglion. So the interesting thing about the adrenal medulla cells is that they're actually modified postganglionic cells. So they're, instead of having postganglionic cells, they are the cells that produce these neurotransmitters and hormones made by the adrenal medulla. So the interesting thing is that these neurotransmitters usually secreted by postganglionic fibers are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Well, instead of actually secreting these onto yet another tissue, these are going to secrete, if you have preganglionic activity, this is going to trigger the production of these neurotransmitters or these chemicals, epinephrine and norepinephrine, by the adrenal medulla. Okay, so this is big difference between adrenal medulla. So no ganglion. There's no ganglion. There's no collateral ganglion. It's just preganglionic straight to the medulla. And instead of postganglionic fibers, you have the adrenal medulla cells. Now, which specific cells? That's more for like if you're taking med school. But again, this is a big difference between the sympathetic, a typical sympathetic preganglionic and postganglionic versus the innervation of the adrenal medulla. Now, parasympathetic innervation. So why is it parasympathetic? So para also means like to the side as well, right? Like paravertebral. So why is it parasympathetic? Well, if you put the two close, so again, this is a sympathetic nervous system. If you kind of overlay the two, parasympathetic nervous system, and again, this is another reason why that the parasympathetic fibers are longer in the preganglionic fibers. So notice that like you have the sympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are very close to the vertebrae and spinal cord, whereas the parasympathetic, you have a further distance away from the spinal cord. Now, again, the arrangement of this, so again, and this is why we have that elongated, and this is why it kind of has like, at least if you're looking at the left side, it kind of looks like a big D, right? So why? Because you have longer preganglionic fibers, and the ganglia are further away from the spinal cord, but located closer to the target organs. And parasympathetic responses, so we already covered this earlier. And actually, I'm ahead of time for once. But yeah, I'll see you all on Wednesday, and take care, and thanks to our moderators as well. See you all. See you, and we'll finish up the autonomic nervous system on Wednesday. All right, take care. See you later.